And then it is on you to follow up with reminders. That is a big one. I had to follow up with a lot of my people over
2 to 6 letters.
Sorry? Did someone have a question? Sorry.
I just don't think they realized they were on unmute when they joined.
That's okay. It happens. Welcome to, life in the Zoom era again, but no worries. If you do have a question, I tend to talk fast, but just interject and I will stop. But yeah, giving somebody a timeline for when you would like the letter, and asking on a timeline that makes sense for that is a huge, huge, huge advantage. There are things like Interfolio where they can write it right away and store it somewhere, and that way it's secure. And then a lot of schools will offer something like a committee letter, and that is something that you should also look into, especially if you're currently in undergrad or if you are attending an undergrad institution to retake some classes or anything like that. Usually, if this is something that your school offers, your pre-health advisor will be well aware of that, and they will probably have already talked to you about that. Usually, if your school offers a committee letter, that is what the med school will want to see. So what we've suggested as far as like preparing a letter writer, and we'll kind of get to that. Like you're going to want to send them like a resume, a personal statement, or kind of like just a list of things and explanations of like what you do outside of the classroom. You don't need to send them like a 30-page, like, prosaic novel on every activity you've done since you were 5, but you do need to explain like, hey, here's what I do outside of the classroom. Here are all the things that I'm juggling right now, and stuff like that. And it's worth noticing that every school has a different set of requirements, and those requirements can be different based on like who they want to hear from and like where you are in terms of life stage. So like they may want 1 or 2 of your science professors to write. They may require 1 from a humanities professor. They may require 1 from a job supervisor in place of a science professor if you've been out of school for a little bit. But most schools have a minimum and a maximum. So pay attention to who you're asking for your letters and see if you can maximize it so you're not asking 15 people for letters and then you're stuck trying to figure out, okay, which, 3 of those 15 do I think ended up being the best. Alrighty. So what should be in an LOR? So you want to, again, provide letter writers with some of this, like the guidelines for writing a letter. Like I always hyperlinked it, and we'll actually kind of get to how you can reach out. But the guidelines for writing a letter and then the core competencies are a big one. Those are things that the schools don't always need to see like explicitly listed out in like bullet form in a letter of like, oh, this person, is professional. And here's an example. You really want somebody who can speak to some of those, I would say, a bit more broadly and integrate them into their letter. And so at this point, we've talked a little bit about like providing a packet with the personal statement draft and the CV and stuff. I'm actually going to escape out of this for a little bit because I want to show you guys this packet. Can you guys still see my screen? Marvelous, thumbs up. Okay, so this is a packet that one of my classmates used to send to people that he was asking to write letters for him. So you can see he's got kind of just a short blurb of these are the things I'm doing outside of this. And, it involves, in the case of like, let's say his TED stuff, it's paid work for some very like non-medical things, but also like he did speaker coaching and he worked with a ton of different speakers from different areas. Like kind of think about the experiences that you've had and what you would want to highlight about them, because even though your rec letter hopefully knows you pretty well, they may not know all the details and may not know how to adequately portray some of the things that you think are important. And you shouldn't be afraid to share that. So he also included, again, the guidelines. And some of these are all online. And we talk about like the competencies. And again, like we'll have the slides uploaded. And so you should be able to kind of find this link a little bit later, but this is the kind of thing that he would send as a full-on attachment to the person that he was asking to write a rec letter. So with that said, back to our slides. Alrighty. So these are actually We have two examples of how to email somebody that you would like to be a letter writer. And these are actually emails that I sent. So even though they've been de-identified, like I will go ahead and own up to writing both of these. So if they seem a little bit casual, the second one is definitely more casual based on like how I knew that person. But this was a letter that I sent asking, I'd asked somebody in person saying like, hey, would you be willing to write me a positive letter of rec? And then when the time came for me to start putting my application together and like AMCAS was open and I was starting to like kind of, get all my ducks in a row, this is what I emailed. So, I said kind of the similar thing to what my classmate did. I attached a copy of my CV that includes some of my awards, employment, things I do outside of the classroom. And for me, because I'm non-trad, it's from both undergrad and post-bac so that they can see like I haven't just been sitting around like knitting socks in the 5 years that I took off of school. Like I've worked on things and here's why they were important to me and what I enjoyed about them. I included the competencies as well. And I also included, usually I had hyperlinks in, but stuff for like AMCAS letter service. I actually did not use Interfolio. I know some of my classmates did. But I would try to include the instructions for how to submit. So when I reached out to any of my letter writers, I assumed that some of them I knew had written rec letters before, but I sent everybody the same email that said like, hey, here's my AMCAS ID. Here are the instructions for how to use this form. Like make it as foolproof as possible so that worst case scenario, they can flag that email. And then if they have issues, they can go back and reference it. And then here was my option for somebody who actually lived across the state. I had moved, and so I couldn't ask this person in person. And again, it's a super casual letter. This is somebody who used to be one of my supervisors, who I knew really well. And the Daily refers to the newspaper that I used to work for, but basically asking this person like, hey, like it's been a while. I'm sorry we haven't kept in touch, but we've had a lot going on. And I was wondering if you'd be willing and able to write a positive letter of recommendation in support of my application. The phrasing for that, again, is key. And I mean, you can see in here where I basically said, I'm still figuring out how all of this works. And I will probably send you many more emails about like AMCAS and the letter service. And I basically followed up with that first example that I showed with this person, but I also gave them an out and I basically said like, hey, if you've got too much on your plate, like that's okay. I can ask somebody else. This doesn't have to happen now, but part of the reason that you ask early. So I think for most of these letter writers, I asked around January, if not a bit before, but part of that was so that it was on their plate early. They had plenty of time. Hopefully there wasn't so much going on in the next like 5 to 6 months that there was no possible window for them to complete it. Versus I know a few people who have been kind of in a crunch and they've had to ask people at the 11th hour, like May 1st for a letter. And that starts to get really tight. And that's the point where you may actually have people tell you, no, I can't get it done on your timeline. All right, sorry, my mouse is very sensitive, so it kind of bopped around a little bit. So you guys have probably seen this, and at this point you might be slightly nauseated by it, but we've talked about the core competencies before, but that's kind of a huge point to your application. Most of your application should be kind of aimed at these. And we've talked, I think, briefly about how you might address certain parts of that in other parts of your application. But you really want to kind of, give your letter writers a polite nudge in this direction and kind of say like, oh, this person, scientific inquiry, like this person was curious. They weren't just like sitting around pipetting and like drinking things out of the beakers in my lab. Like they were curious and they asked good questions. Speaking of questions, I see one in the chat. So do the letters need to be completed by the time that applications are due? No. And we can kind of sort of get there, but like the gist with a letter, and it's a little bit variable based on the school. A lot of my letters were not in the day I submitted my application. That said, some schools will not review your application until it's complete, which means all letters are in. Some schools are fine just getting your letters as they roll. So they'll review like the rest of your application, assuming like your MCAT score is in and all that. And they'll just kind of take the letters in as they get them. So, I mean, the idea, in a perfect world, you would want everything kind of coming in around the same time. But like I had an issue with one of my letter writers who kept despite my best efforts, she would mail in a hard copy of the letter, but not include the sheet that you have to include that has like your AMCAS ID and everything on that. And so she sent in 3 or 4 copies of her rec letter for me that never got attached to my application. So I had a letter that didn't come in until I think late August, which was great. So
I have a question.
yeah.
So I was wondering how recent of a letter, like how recent should a letter of rec be? So like, is there a thing, like such a thing as too much time passing between when the letter was written and like when you apply to med school?
That's a good question because I have actually never sat on an admissions committee, but I imagine that if somebody had sent in a letter that was dated like 2 years ago, that might look a little suspect. The suggestion there, because the AAMC requires that letters remain confidential, like you automatically waive your right to see them. An option for that, let's say you have somebody who offers 2 years in advance and they're like, what if I just send this to you? And then you can just like attach it yourself. And it's like, no, that doesn't work. What they can do is they can store it in your Interfolio profile. I believe, and I think Lauren is still on this call, but Lauren used Interfolio and she can tell you a little bit more about how that works. But what they can do is actually upload it and then go through and update it a little bit closer to the cycle. And so that would be the suggestion. Instead of having them like write it and try to like hand it off, I would suggest to them like, hey, if you write it, like, can you give it like another once over, maybe a month before the application cycle starts, like change the date, this, that, and the other. I had one of my letters was written about a year in advance, and then I ended up postponing my application cycle. And so I think that's what she did, is she held on to it because I let her know, hey, I'm still applying, just not now. And I think she basically took that letter, tidied it up, and then sent it along.
Okay, because I got a letter from a doctor I shadowed my sophomore year in the summer of sorry. So I got a letter like my sophomore summer year of undergrad, and they just sent it to me. So I'm not sure if that's like, if I should like email them again and tell them to wait until I apply.
So run me through that one more time. You can also put this one in the chat. It's okay. I'm just trying to make sure I follow.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just put it in the chat.
Okay. Because that way, yeah. Also, it like, love you guys. Please don't, if you DM me with a question, I can't answer like a full-on series of questions right now. I can just see like bits and pieces coming up in the chat. My guess for that one, based off of like the bit that I heard, you're going to want to email them back and say like, hey, hang on to this. And then I'll get an email to you with like how to submit it and how to go about that process. Okay. So for CU specific examples for rec letters, CU says you must submit a minimum of 3, but you can submit up to 5 letters. If the school offers a committee letter, that is what CU would prefer to see. And if a student sends the max number of letters, do you read them all? CU does. As far as preference, there's no need to have 5 letters, and sometimes 3 is totally sufficient. The biggest thing, and this could be, I mean, this is really true of anywhere that you apply, you just want to make sure that you are asking the best possible options. As far as like who your letter writers are, like people that can write you the strongest possible letter. What makes a great letter of recommendation? Have someone who knows you well, and especially if they know you over time is ideal. Because not only can they speak to you like, oh, I knew this person through a really intense period of their life, or like I saw them every day for a month for long hours, but if they can speak to like how you have grown and developed over like a year or even 2, that's very telling to an admissions committee, especially if the letter is very, very strong. What mistakes do students make? Common mistake is getting letters from someone who doesn't know you well. The letter might say they were in my biology class and they got an A, so I'm assuming they did fine. Like that's, I have a friend who actually has gotten a letter like this. And I guess that's all that professor ever writes, but it might be worth asking around if you know people in your school, or maybe your pre-med advisor, if you've got one through your school, like, hey, here's what I'm thinking of asking. Do you know if other students have asked them before? Do they tend to write good letters? Do they tend to be like behind? Ask for kind of like the data on who your options are, at least as far as your academic letters go. And sometimes professors will offer too, which is really cool. So as far as example letters of recommendation, I have not written one for med school. But this is one that I wrote for somebody who used to work for me for her, I think, a master's in finance program. And she actually got into one of the top programs in the country, which is pretty cool. So this was a letter that I wrote last year. And I've kind of highlighted some of the key points. So like, you know, she worked for me directly in 2019 over like a 3-month window. And you're kind of thinking like, okay, that's like nice seasonal work. Like this, she barely knows her, but turns out like I've known this person for several years. And 6 years is not a small amount of time. So, and using like big descriptive words, like she is brilliant, tenacious, creative, works well on a team. Like these are all things that you want to ask people who can say these things about you. So like build an exhaustive list of people who like know you in different contexts. And then honestly, you can start making pros and cons. You want to make sure, again, they can say good things. A good letter should honestly kind of make it seem like the sun shines out of your, you know, dark places. So you want specific examples. You want like descriptive, but not flowery language. And then as you can kind of see like down through, I would say like the middle 2 paragraphs of this letter, you really want like a punchline. So like, here is kind of an anecdote about how this person performed in their job, or here is, you know, something they did when they worked in my lab or when they volunteered in the clinic, and they're very competent, they're very remarkable. And here's, you know, this person gave the examples, but then the punchline at the end of the paragraph or at the end of the letter where it's like, and then I'm going to reiterate and say it point blank so you don't miss it. They are competent, they are respectful, they are curious, they're whatever. Like you want people who are not only able to speak to things, but also speak to it clearly. And this is where it can be really helpful when you're asking to provide context to your letter writers. So in the form of a CV or meeting for coffee, so that you can help them flesh out the gaps. So in this case, like I knew this person really well. I'd worked with them for a couple of years and I had a lot to go off of. I've written other letters where I've actually gotten the person on the phone and had them like walk me through their resume or their CV. And I've asked them questions about like, what was this work experience like? And to use some of their own words and give me like a more personal take on something beyond just like 3 lines on a resume, so that I can kind of highlight some of the things that like I know might have been there, but that just didn't come across from just a tiny 1-page resume. So like the example here, if you look in the top paragraph, I worked at Philmont Scout Ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico. To the average person, that means next to nothing. And then when I explained like, oh, I worked for the Boy Scouts, they're like, oh, that's cute. You were a camp counselor. Sure. I was a camp counselor at the largest camping operation in the world. And we served 22 to 24,000 kids every summer over 220 square miles of wilderness. So like when you put it in context and I talk about the things that I did out there, it makes a lot more sense instead of saying like, oh, she's great with kids. Because my job was so much more than being great with kids, but that's, you may have to provide some of that to people depending on who they are and what they're trying to achieve with the letter or what you want them to achieve with the letter. So again, it's ideal to choose someone who knows you, but also knows you and the role and your performance really well. And they can explain like why what you did was so impressive. So moving on to school requirements. So for the most part, every school has different requirements. This is where we're going to talk a little bit about like MSAR, if you guys are familiar with that. So the biggest thing that I like to harp on here is that most of these schools have similar requirements. Some schools have no requirements, but they have like suggestions. Treat those as requirements just to be safe. And then some of them are phrased a little bit differently. So like on here, we have like English and / humanities. And it's like, okay, which one's which? Well, sometimes English counts as humanities. Sometimes they want both. They want to see like English and then anthropology, or English and then psych. Or they don't really care about English and they just want to see 18 hours of something that wasn't in the sciences. And then the other common like kind of sticking point you'll see is that a lot of people want 1 year of organic chemistry with lab. And then there are some schools that will say, or 1 semester of OChem, 1 semester of biochem. My personal suggestion, and this was given to me by my pre-med advisor, I would take both. Biochem is huge for the MCAT. So I might consider taking both, even if one is just given as like an option. If schools want English at all, just fair warning, it is usually a year, but some schools, so for me, like the cycle that I went through, like Oregon Health and Science, and then I think Emory actually wanted more hours than just like the one semester or the 1 year. You can claim AP credit and community college as long as it shows up on your college transcript. So if you need to submit stuff like that, make sure you do it. And always check in again, if you have an advisor, like make sure you're checking in with them to make sure that you are satisfying requirements. You can also always email a school and ask like, hey, does this count towards your, genetics requirement, or would this count as biology? Yes or no? I'm going to take
Can I ask a real quick question about the course requirements? You said that Oregon and Emory told you they wanted more hours. So if you submit your application and they say, oh, we want an extra writing course from you, they let you know that that's the reason. They don't just send you a rejection and leave you hanging. They tell you that it was the course.
No, so they will not tell you. And it is, so that section, and I can see if I can pull up like a spreadsheet, and we'll kind of talk about that when we get into like creating a school list. But like I made a spreadsheet of what schools I wanted to apply to, and then requirements are almost always online. And if you have a question, if it's not like clear as glass on their website, or you're like, hey, I took, like my example would be, I was an anthropology major, which at my school was only a Bachelor of Arts. Mm-hmm. But I did my senior thesis more on the genetics side. And so even though it was a liberal arts class, like it was very much science-based. And I emailed a few schools saying, hey, does that count? Would that fulfill your genetics requirement? Mm-hmm. But it is on you to look at what their requirements are and go to them with questions. They will not let you know. They'll just look at your transcript and go, meh, no English.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
You think about the number of applications, they probably won't. But and also I got a question, what if you don't feel like you know any professors personally or well enough to have them write a fleshed out letter for you? That one is kind of tricky because it's kind of, as much as I hate to say it, and like I definitely couldn't have done this the first time I went through undergrad, the onus is on you to kind of make connections and do your best to do that. Again, my first time through undergrad, I was in a 400-person chemistry class, and I was petrified of that professor. Like I avoided him. I would go to the other side of the hallway. He was very scary. Keep in mind that not every letter has to come from one of your science professors, for one. But and I don't know, to the person who sent this to me, I don't know like what year you are in school, but this tends to get a little bit easier, even at huge schools like University of Texas, 50,000 people. As you move up in your coursework, the classes tend to get a little bit smaller and a little bit more focused. And I felt like those were the people that I had an easier time getting to know, for one, and then probably getting stronger letters out of, for two. And I will say, like, if you end up taking time after school to kind of like recenter, maybe take a year or two to work on your application, like the jobs that you do in that time and research supervisors and stuff like that, those are all people who can write for you. Like really the sky is the limit. You'll have to have some academic letters, and some of that is just, you got to ask and really kind of do your part to make those connections. But for the most part, like you have options on who you can ask outside of faculty. I just saw Gary pop on. Hey, Gary. All right. So as far as course requirements, you don't need to be a science major. Again, I was anthropology and actually journalism. I joke that is double unemployable, but like when you have a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Journalism, like next to nothing I took actually counted. And I had to go through and I did a post-bac, but there are ways to be a liberal arts major or even a journalism major and also fulfill all of the requirements that med schools would want you to have. I would say, like, definitely consider timing your classes to consider like the MCAT. The semester before I took the MCAT, again, I had gone back to school, but I was in OChem 2. I had just taken biochem, and I was in physics 2, and then I was tutoring for Gen Chem 2. So I took a super heavy chemistry load. But that honestly made my MCAT studying a little bit lighter because when I was in school, I was basically studying for the MCAT. And then when I wasn't in class, I was basically studying for the MCAT. Again, the unusual courses, mine was anthropology, but you never know. Like you can always email a school and ask like, hey, here's the course description. Does this fit what you guys are asking for as far as your math requirement? Or, you know, would this count towards genetics or molecular bio? And then double checking the course requirements for each school. Again, I'll kind of show you guys how I did this. It might take me a second because I forgot to pull up my spreadsheet. But keeping really close track of, have I taken this class? Does it actually count for that requirement? And is there anything else I'm missing? And when am I going to take it? That becomes really key, especially if you're planning on applying straight out of undergrad, like timing your coursework so that everything is done and you're not like crunching, taking like one last summer class right before you also try to start med school. So creating a school list. I'd say real quick, does anybody have any questions on that section? You can shout them out. I'm actually going to pull up my school list really quick.
I actually do have one more question.
Yeah.
In the event that, let's say I go to create my school list and I see maybe I should take a statistics class or something, do you just have to have that class completed by the time you matriculate? So you could say on your application that you plan on completing it, or?
I believe so. I think the way it's always been phrased, and if anybody from my class who's on here, or if there are any of the deans that know better, I believe it just has to be able to show up on a transcript, like a final transcript before you matriculate.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I second that. I think as long as you have it by the time that they ask for your transcripts, if you're all, you know, going to have the requirements, you should be good to go.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I also have a really quick question. It's about a specific situation, but I'm hoping maybe it applies to other people too.
Yeah.
So my organic chemistry professor last semester offered to write me a letter of rec, and I took him up on it. And then he said
That's
that
awesome.
he wanted to wait until I'm applying to write it. And I'm worried that he's going to forget about what kind of student I was and that. And so I kind of suggested that he write it then, but he really wanted to wait. And so I'm thinking, should now that a little bit of time has passed, I should ask him, or should I wait because I might be able to do research or like maybe like broaden my resume to send it to him? Is it something that like, if you're going to have to sit down and talk with them and like refresh them anyways, like it's not going to be a big deal that we waited like a year and a half? Or do you think I should go ahead and like ask for it now?
I'm a big fan of just keeping in touch in general.
Okay.
So again, like one of my letter writers was actually my senior thesis advisor from undergrad. So the letter that she wrote came 5 years after I took her class.
Okay.
But I was really intentional about keeping in touch with her. So even though like it had been years since I had worked with her academically, and, you know, ultimately we didn't end up publishing, it was this whole thing, but she was still able to speak to the quality of student that I was, and also was able to say like, you know, this person has never lost their curiosity and their passion for learning, even in 5 years of honestly being a ski bum.
Okay.
So I'm a big fan of keeping in touch, and that way it's less of a catch-up session when this person does eventually write your letter.
Okay.
But I would say if they've offered, definitely like take them up on that. Never turn down
Right.
an offer.
Okay.
Because if somebody specifically offers, that's usually a really positive sign.
Okay. I just want to make sure it's not uncommon, you know, for time to pass and then have to go back and refresh.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Olivia, could I check one question for the school requirements? This would be probably for more non-traditional students like me.
Uh-huh.
So I checked with my pre-med advisor on different requirements and said to him, well, should I take the English classes again? When I took them way back when in undergrad, I was an English major. Now I'm doing all the math, all the science. And he said, don't worry about doing English because you were a major in it, but this was 2 decades ago or so. So I'm thinking, is it worth skipping those couple classes? It would be lovely to be able to not worry about them, but I'm thinking, is it worth skipping a couple classes like that if some committees would think, oh, well, he took everything, but he didn't take these, kind of thing, if that makes sense.
I think that'll depend a little bit on the schools that you ultimately choose to apply to. And that was part of how I built my school list, which we'll get into. The schools that seem to have timelines, it's usually more focused on their hard science requirements, which is kind of what your advisor is speaking to, is like they're less concerned with your command of the English language after getting a degree in it, even if it was 20 years ago, like they're pretty sure that you are fine from a humanities standpoint. But what they do want to see is how old is your OChem class? So like if you had been an OChem major 20 years ago, they may actually ask you to retake those. But I would check school specific websites. Schools are really good about posting their admissions requirements. And if they have a timeline like, oh, all science classes must have been completed in the last 7 years or something like that, that's the stuff you pay attention to. And again, you can always email their admissions committee or office and ask and say like, hey, like I've noticed that you have a timeline set out where it says like all prerequisites must have been completed in the last 6 or 7 years. I was an English major. Is there an exception? Do I need to take another English class? And that can either shape like whether you apply to that school at all. That's kind of your prerogative, right? Or they'll let you know like, oh no, really that just applies to like our science requirements or suggestions or anything like that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and move on to create a school list. This was one of my favorite and least favorite parts, like hands down, it was the best and the worst. So things that you want to consider when you are picking where to apply. So I just kind of shared a little bit with Scott about like, honestly, part of how I built my list out was who requires what, and have I taken those things? Have I taken enough of those things? And did I take them online? Which is less of an issue now with COVID. I was actually, believe it or not, there was a time where some schools would tell you if you've taken any of our prerequisite coursework online, it doesn't count. And so those were schools that I could not apply to. But I would say a big one on here, we have location. So the best advice that I got was don't apply anywhere that you are not interested in living. Even though it seems like, oh, you can like cast a wide net and apply all over. It's like, nah, really, like you shouldn't apply somewhere if you think you're going to be unhappy there. For me, that was Florida. And I apologize if we have anybody from Florida on the call, but that was just going to be a no-go for me. Pay attention to the stats of the school. This is where an MSAR membership comes in really handy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but kind of knowing like roughly what your GPA will be, ballpark, by the time you're graduating, you should have a pretty good idea, or by the time you're finishing your post-bac program, you have an idea of like, okay, things have been going pretty well, things are going okay. And how do I measure up to like the average at these schools? We talked a little bit and a lot of it about prerequisite coursework. Do I want to apply to this place if they're going to require me to take an extra year of English or retake my year of English, or, they want to see everything in the last 7 years, but this school is okay with like the last 10. Kind of prioritizing based on that is really helpful, especially for non-trads. And honestly, one of the things that I considered very heavily, and I think ultimately it was one of the reasons that I like CU so much, focusing on the mission of the school as hand wavy and like fuzzy, like warm feeling that sounds like. Really look at the mission, look at what interests you about the school, because if they ask you, why did you apply here? You want to have a good answer and you want to go somewhere that like you feel like you fit. You want to pay attention to the curriculum. So like CU's in the process, we actually just brought in our first class who are on our like new, I don't want to say accelerated curriculum, but like they do most of their didactic coursework in kind of an extended year-long period, versus like the traditional like 2 years didactic, 2 years in the clinic. So you can kind of think about like what would that mean for you? How do you learn best? And then also with CU, they're transitioning to more of a longitudinal like clerkship and rotation model for third year. So instead of having like a 6-week or an 8-week or even a 4-week block where you do nothing but pediatrics for that window of time, CU, among other schools, are transitioning to where like I might be in a peds clinic on Monday and I might be in, psych outpatient on Tuesday afternoons. And then all day Wednesday, I am in the local hospital for like internal med. And then Thursdays are a mix of like clinic surgery. And then afternoon, I'm in the OR. And then Friday is like, maybe I'm in the ER or it's flex time or something like that. And then that just repeats for like longer than your normal block window. If you're considering special programs, looking at what those look like for the individual schools, so stuff like MD, PhDs and combos within MPH, as well as if they have any specific like tracks that focus more on like global health or underserved urban care or research. You do want to look at tuition. And again, that was part of how I shaped my list. And I can show you guys how I did that in a second. But being a Wyoming resident, I was in a unique position where I didn't have an in-state option. And so that opened up a lot of options for me in a weird way. And then also meant that there were a lot of schools that I really couldn't or shouldn't have applied to. Things like residency placement success rate can be a little bit hard to dig up, but if you can find it, it's really good information on like how many students match to their first or second or third or whatever choice. Learning environment facilities, I felt like I got a better feel on interview days. Again, COVID era, that has changed a little bit, but you can find a lot of that on the internet and then like forums with current students. And then the biggest one that I think, again, I didn't have an in-state med school, but out-of-state acceptance rates. Some schools will make exceptions for this based on if you have significant ties to the state or the region or something like that. But what counts as a significant tie can be really variable. Some schools want to hear like, you know, I consider this my home more so than my actual home state, and this is where I want to be. And like, that's the kind of level they want to hear, not just like, oh, we vacation there every summer. My grandmother lives here and I love it. Like that's a tie, but it's not as good as somebody who is like throwing down love for that state and basically declaring their intent to go there and never leave and serve that population. Public schools versus private. Public may or may not accept more in-state students. It really depends on kind of the region and the school. So I think like CU is something like 50% out of state. And there are like some weird gray zones with this. So like Lauren and I can both speak to like kind of the WWAMI program. So the University of Washington's partnership, it looks like they have a great out of state like matriculation percentage, but it's focused on a 5-state area and they don't take people outside of those 5 states. So it can be a little bit misleading. Go ahead and I will show you guys my spreadsheet, which is a maze of colors. But yeah, so you can kind of see, like I made my list, I alphabetized it and I colored it because what else do you do when you're super type A and you have entirely too much time and neuroticism on your hands to channel into a spreadsheet? I also used a lot of conditional formatting. Most of my school list, was built using what's called the WICHE program. So it's the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, and they do a bunch of like pre-health program partnerships. So Wyoming, again, does not have its own med school. There are a lot of pre-health programs that it doesn't have. So they partner with different states, mostly in the Western Interstate region, where I'm not necessarily in state, but I can actually negotiate with certain states like Arizona. And I could have negotiated to be considered tuition-wise an in-state student in the state of Arizona based on a partnership they have with Wyoming. I don't know if it preferentially changes where you sit on like their admissions hierarchy. I've been told yes, and I've also been told very much no. But for me, this was my equivalent of being able to apply in-state multiple places. So that was kind of how I built my list. So you can see like that's my WICHE column. And I can, if you're interested, you can DM me and I can send you this link. But I looked at like what was the median GPA, and this is all like old information, but where do I sit compared to their median GPA? If I shaded it green, it was, you know, roughly where my GPA was. You can tell that I had higher than a 3.82, but not quite a 3.89. Median MCAT, I definitely did not score a 520. And I was looking at stuff like standard deviations to kind of see like, okay, did I fall like close enough? Same thing, MSAR talks about like research percentage, and it's kind of a weird metric because like every school on there will show like, oh, like over 90% of students have research experience. That can be a little and it can be a lot. And what I realized is schools like, where is it? Like Case Western, very, very, very research driven institution. And it shows 97%. And then as you get down towards places like Albany Medical College, like even CU, because it's not like, you know, it's not Mayo, like their focus is not on churning out tons and tons and tons of academic attendings. It's still a great med school. It's just their focus is maybe more on the actual clinical and hands-on, or at least on being maybe slightly more well-rounded compared to someplace like Case Western or Mayo. So I listed out all the prerequisite courses, and I would actually color change these based on if I'd completed them or not. So you can tell I had not updated this spreadsheet, but like bio with lab 2 semesters. Well, I only took 1 intro bio course, but that was the school where I had emailed and said like, hey, does my, liberal arts genetics course count? We did PCR and everything like that. It's just, it was under the catalog as a liberal arts course. And I also kept track of like, okay, how many letters do they want? Who do they want them from? What does that mean? Like, am I going to assign Deborah's letter over Nate's? Do I only get to assign 3? And so it's like Deborah, Carlin, Nate, that's what they want.
Replacements though.
And then I would also make notes on, do they have a secondary fee? Do they need things like Casper? Which again, that has changed a little bit from when I applied. But again, I'm happy to share this. It was kind of an asinine experience to build, but it was really helpful as far as like staying organized and then tracking like metrics and deadlines. So pop back in here. So the AAMC organizes, there's kind of in the same-ish way. They've got like this little block where you can talk about like, okay, the course offerings, like, do they have the classes that I want or the structure that I want? Do they have a heavy focus on research? Do I have a heavy focus on research? Do I even know yet? Things like tuition, financial aid, and programs for minority or disadvantaged students, like those can be really important in making one's choice because of how they affect how you pay for school. Teaching methods is a big one, especially like as schools have like changed to and from Zoom, and then some schools are actually moving away from gross anatomy lab and are doing entirely like virtual anatomy. So knowing about things like that, sorry, sensitive mouse. But AAMC just kind of has this little worksheet where you can kind of do this for every school that you might be interested in, kind of do like a mass pros cons list. So the MSAR. Is there anybody who is not familiar with the MSAR? I feel like this is like one of the most used acronyms among pre-med students. But the MSAR basically compiles like all of the information from the last cycle from every school and pulls it all in one like utterly overwhelming and beautiful place. So it talks about matriculant demographics. So like, what was the average age? Did they have research? What sort of experiences did they have? But it's like all the data you could ever want, and then probably some data that you care a little bit less about. The price for MSAR is not prohibitive. Thank you. AAMC, of all the things that they charge us money for, this one is probably one of the more affordable ones. But you can also get a 2-year subscription if you are part of the fee assistance program. So even if cost is a significant barrier for you in applying to med school, this is one of the benefits of checking out the fee assistance program because it can be really helpful. So MSAR, it kind of breaks stuff down, and we hadn't logged in. If you log in, you can see a little bit more information about like where it says subscribers only, and it'll show you like what was their median information, what was, the average outside of that. But you can kind of shift through schools, and you can sort also. Like if I were to scroll down, if I was actually on the page, that left side bar, I can filter out schools that have, I don't know, if their median MCAT was like a 518, well, I didn't score that high. That might be a bit of a reach for me. So I'm going to go ahead and like scoot that little slider bar down, and you can kind of filter schools out and start building your school list based on like the raw metrics pretty easily using the MSAR. So the med school directory, we're not going to go into this one too much. The link is here, and the slides will be posted after this. But the med school directory is kind of a free alternative that uses a Lizzie M score instead of like all of the MSAR stuff. It's designed to be a little bit more accessible. But this is something to consider using when you're not like imminently in the cycle. It's kind of a cool resource. So Lizzie M, and again, Student Doctor Network, like you always take it with a grain of salt, right? Like there are people who put like trial scores in, and you see stuff on the forums, and like it can always just kind of be like this demoralizing place. Like the internet is great and terrible at the same time. But the cool thing about the Lizzie M score is that it kind of allows you to like guesstimate like where you might fit on an acceptance curve. I don't know how often it's updated, and I think it's based off of AAMC aggregate data. So I'm sure like periodically they might have to redo some math, but it's kind of a neat little tool. It's worth checking out if you've got like an extra 5 or 10 or 20, 30 minutes to go down that rabbit hole and just kind of see what you can shake out of it. So some of these final tips and tricks, and again, if you're one of the like CU students or a dean or somebody on this call and you want to chime in on any of these are just kind of some of the last like parting notes that we've got. So we talked a little bit about like the schools that have in-state agreements for out-of-state students. And so on the MSAR, pay attention to those. We mentioned the WAMI program specifically because again, that's University of Washington looks like it has an incredible out-of-state acceptance rate, but that's only true if you live in Washington or Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, or Idaho. Similarly, like University of Utah, like they do take out-of-state students, but the way that is skewed, they have an agreement with the state of Idaho preferentially, not with the state of like Wyoming, for example. So when I applied to Utah, what I didn't know because I didn't research this super well was like, they're part of the Witchy region, but I was applying for one of 5 spots in their class because they have a great out-of-state rate, but most of those are from Idaho and they have a preferential, like, I think it's like 20 something spots go to Idaho residents. Talk to your pre-med advisor, or if you need to, find a pre-med advisor. They are really helpful. And you can also talk to, if you know people who have gone through this process before, you can always ask them. I actually asked one of my TAs who was applying to medical school for help building my school list. That Reddit link, it's a little bit outdated, but whoever put that post together did a really great job kind of summarizing like what makes a school in-state versus out-of-state preferential or out-of-state friendly. And so even though the data is not up to date, the overall trends are probably pretty much the same. And then it also talks about like how they made that distinction. So were they looking at the number of out-of-state people that they interviewed, the number that matriculated, and where to put the emphasis when you're kind of going through the MSAR. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that up for a second. If you guys want to go ahead and scan it, we'll have you guys do our survey. And then on the side, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our MSAR stuff and we can kind of peek through that a little bit more. But here, let me do this real quick. All right, is that still big enough that people can scan it? Marvelous. Okay, let me pull this up in another tab if I can. Nope, go away. All right. Okay. Lauren coming through in the chat with the link. Perfect. Yeah. So at this point, if you guys have questions, go ahead and shout them out, put them in the chat. I'll leave the survey like QR code up for another minute or two. And then I'll pull the MSAR stuff over and we can kind of like scroll through that a little bit just as people ask questions, but it'll be pretty chill. Gary raises a good point. Like truthfully, had I applied to a Florida school and gotten in, I think I would have gone, but He's got cooler roommates. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and I'll bring this over and we can kind of peek at it. Yeah, if you guys have questions, like again, stick them in the chat. Shout out. Survey link. Ooh, that is a good question. Lauren, do you happen to have the survey link? Because I am not going to be in a position to like scan it and then try to get the link in. Or
Yeah,
if somebody did, thank you. Or if somebody did scan it and can put that link in the chat.
Hey, Olivia, I got a question if I could.
Yeah.
So as I'm starting to learn about all the spectrum of stuff to do to prepare for applying to med school, when I was thinking of letters of recommendation, not knowing too much details about them, I was thinking, well, this seems like a very small thing compared to all the other things. But would you say that it can turn into a project and be somewhat on par with some of the other aspects of preparing for med school? Or still pretty minor?
I mean, so it's an important part. Like well, I haven't written a letter for med school directly. I have helped my brother write one. He's a grad student, and his PI does not write the letters himself. He kicks it to a grad student. And my brother, who is wonderful and writes actually pretty well, he's also dyslexic. So I usually proofread his stuff just to be sure. And so from that, I can tell you that like you need to have letters that are going to make you seem like the best thing since toast. Like it's worth taking the little bit of time to come up with like a good list and making the good ask, and kind of getting all your ducks in a row. Where I had an advantage there is that I postponed my whole application cycle by a year. I had pretty much everything together and kind of knew who I was going to ask. And then like my last couple of practice MCATs were absolutely awful. And I postponed my whole cycle based on that. And what that did is it let me focus on the MCAT, but then I also had extra time to fine tune a lot of that stuff. So like the letters are important, but they are not, as far as I can tell, they're probably not going to like dominate most of your time through this process because so much of it is out of your hands. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. I'm just going to click through. I'm sorry, because I have not been in here in a couple years and I'm just very curious. Accept applicants from wherever. Slightly biased. And I can quit screen sharing if this is like not helpful. I'm just so curious. And you guys can ask questions about anything because literally just I'm scrolling through this for giggles at this point and just kind of to see what it's about and what it looks like these days. And so that you guys know. Yeah, if you guys have questions about school lists or MSAR or letters or anything like that, give a shout. Oh, okay. So Elena, my answer to that is a big yes. So in the chat, Elena asked, if you're planning on taking a gap year or a couple gap years before you apply to medical school, would you recommend asking people who you would like to write your letters now? So that way they know to expect it later on. I would say yes. If there are people that you want letters from now, the earlier you ask, the better, because again, you can always get that letter written and then they can just hang on to it. And again, I think it's a good idea to keep in touch with those people so that you don't just like ask, graduate, fall off the face of the planet and like reappear 6 years later saying like, hey, I'm ready. Do you still have my letter? Like that. You're going to want them to add a little bit more like updated stuff on what you did ideally in like those few years that you've taken off of school. Even if they are writing like kind of a purely academic letter, they can say like, yeah, this person stayed in touch. And, you know, I didn't just know them as like a 22-year-old. I've also known them in the years since, and they are still dedicated to, you know, science and curiosity and however you want to phrase it.
Can I ask a kind of subjective question towards you and Gary or anyone else who's gone through the process already?
Do it.
What would you think about the application process was like the toughest part for you? before sending it out and wishing, like looking back, you were like, I wish I spent more time on that or sorted that out earlier? Like, would it be building the list or the letters of rec or anything else?
I'm really curious to see what some of the other people say to this, because for me, I was also in a bit of a unique situation. I wish I had paid a little more heed to like what I was going to be doing that summer when all the secondaries rolled out. I was working like more than full time. Gary says, yeah, for Gary, it would be letters of rec 100%. Seeing for me, it was like, I didn't think about what came after the application because I had taken that extra year. I was like, oh, like this is gonna be a cakewalk. And I got my application in and then got hit with a wave of secondaries once I got verified, and then I died. Like I used every single day off and every single minute off to like write these secondaries, like frantically trying to get them in within like a reasonable timeline. So while I don't love the idea of like pre-writing your secondaries, and I had looked at like past prompts and had an idea of like, okay, here are the general questions they tend to ask and maybe some things that I should think of examples to use and write about. I do wish that I had maybe set aside some better time for myself, or actually kind of like pre-written or at least pre-outlined a few big prompts. And that would have made secondaries a way less painful experience for me.
Because they ended up being pretty relative to what the secondaries did end up being.
It's more, again, I was working like more than full time at that point, and I used every single day off. So this is when I was working for the Boy Scouts, which like beautiful New Mexico, love hiking on my days off. And instead of hiking on my days off, I spent every day off in like hardwired into the internet in one of the like the medical buildings offices, writing secondaries, which that part kind of sucked. Like I did not have balance for that part of the application, but that was, again, probably a little bit atypical because of how I had spaced out the years before.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and ditto Olivia on that one. I feel like secondaries were the hardest for me. I think in general, having a better idea of like the timeline of the application process would have helped me out like a millionfold. I think that's where I struggled the most as far as like timing my MCAT, which I took late, or knowing that secondaries were going to come so fast. And I was also working full time like Olivia. So like every down second at work, I was working on a secondary, and like still it was tough. So I think like just making a plan and being ready for all of that to come in and knowing what to do is really helpful.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
I'm going to actually read Gary's example because the chat transcript I think might save now that we've got that setting turned on. But he just said, as an example, I got my professor's letters of rec all in my last 2 quarters / semesters, and I got lucky that I got really close to them through TAing. And if it hadn't been for that, I basically never went to office hours or interacted with my professors in any meaningful way. So it's potentially could have gotten some kind of rough or like really lukewarm rec letters, which is not what you want. How early do you advise starting your application? Oh, goodness. That really, I think that one varies a little bit based on what you're doing outside of applying to med school. So like I was ready to apply for like one whole cycle and like spent a whole lot of time on it, and then kicked the whole thing down the road a year because my MCAT score wasn't looking like it was going to be very good. So like I technically started my application like 2 years before I applied, which is to me a little bit excessive. But like if you know that you are like, you want to be traveling, or you're going to be working like a really intense job, or if you want to spend more time making sure that you've got like high quality stuff to write about or to include on your application, like a lot of this is stuff that you can pull together over as much time as you want. And so it really just kind of comes down to your circumstances. And then what's the latest you should take the MCAT? That one, people will give you all sorts of different answers, but I think Dean Suhu is on, and he might be able to give like, I would say a more official answer, but I think most advice that I've seen is that you don't really want to be getting your score like too late in the summer. And remember that it takes about a month for your score. So I took mine mid-May, which means I got my score mid-June, and I think I submitted like within 3 days of getting my score. And then it takes time to like get verified and everything after that. But I would say like very early summer at the latest. But again, like somebody who has done the admissions thing more than once from like the, the applicant side might be able to speak to that a little bit better. Oh, that's a good point, Gary. Yeah, early enough that you can get your score and decide whether or not you're going to retake it. That's a good one. I kicked mine down the road because I knew my first time wasn't going to be a good score, and then the second time, I knew that I was taking it late enough in the game that if I wanted to retake, like when I got my score in like mid-June, I was going to be waiting another year, and that was a risk that I was willing to take. That's a good point. I completely forgotten to mention that. Methods of studying. Hey, Lauren, sorry, I missed the last one. Was the last seminar on the MCAT?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So methods of studying materials. That's, again, that kind of goes back to like our last one. So Elena, I don't know if you were in the last seminar. I was not, because I was at a wedding, but I mean, there's a million options. And again, it kind of comes down to like what you're doing outside of that. So like I studied for the MCAT using a prep course because I knew that I did not have the same level of discipline to just like do my own review. So it really comes down to like how you have studied so far and what has worked best for you and what you're doing outside of that whole application process. So. And yes, the last seminar information, I think if you scroll up in the chat, I think Lauren put the link to, oh, where is it? It's like the diversity and inclusion bit. Let me see if I can copy the link in again, but yes. So you should be able to find it at that link, hopefully. And that should have like transcript and everything posted, so. This is what I wanted. I think this is so cool. And it's so pretty. Most important things to include in a personal essay. So I'm assuming you mean like personal statement. And I think that is something, again, I could be wrong. I think that's going to be the subject of one of our next seminars. I can't remember exactly which order we're doing them in off the top of my head. But I think we do have, I could be wrong. I think we do have a seminar that talks a lot about the personal statement. I know we talked about it a little bit in one of our earliest ones where we talked about like the admissions timeline. So yeah, any other questions about like letters, building a school list, anything tangentially related to any of that? Any advice for re-applicants? For example, should you change your whole entire app the second time around, or can a few things remain the same? I guess it, again, having not sat on the other side of the table before, and also I was not a re-applicant, it's a little hard for me to like kind of take a stab at this. I know the general advice that I've seen around the internet is like you want to at least kind of address the fact that you are reapplying and like kind of talk about the things that you have changed in that last year. Like if it looks like you have done everything the same, like if you're exactly the same person that you were a year ago, they're going to wonder why. And maybe it was just your timeline wasn't great the first time you applied, or, you know, your MCAT score wasn't great. Like they really want to hear like, how have you spent that year improving is kind of the way that I've always heard it phrased. So like maybe not everything needs to change, but consider the things that you would want to update them on, like things that you have done in the last year that you think are important and that were, you know, meaningful to you and that you can speak to, because that's what they want to hear about.
Yeah, this is Jeff Suhu. I'm the Dean of Admissions for the school. I'll echo that. I mean, I think certainly there's aspects of your application you can't change, right? So, you know, your undergraduate transcript is going to be the same every time you apply, et cetera. But I think it's worth sort of trying to figure out potentially where you went wrong is not the right phrase, but just, you know, what the deficiencies in your application might be. And so, you know, if you have a poor undergraduate GPA, then I would love to see that you've taken some post-bac types of classes and done well in them. If you have a suboptimal MCAT, then I would love to see that you've retaken the MCAT and done well. If you had very limited clinical or leadership or volunteer experience or whatever it might be, then I would love to see that you've filled in those gaps. So there's, you know, there's no formula to all of these things, but certainly, as Olivia said, people are looking to see that you've been thoughtful about your application and made some kind of change, whatever that might be. The other reality is the whole process is a little bit random, which is not what everybody wants to hear, but is the truth. And so it's also possible that you could apply with the exact same application and get in, and it's just because of where you applied, if you apply slightly differently, or who read your application on any given day, or you're a year more mature and you interview in a different way, or you know, have a different experience. You know, we have applicants that apply 3-4 times and get in eventually for different reasons. And so certainly being a reapplicant is not an unusual thing. We see a lot of reapplicants, and mostly just because there's so many people that apply that don't get in. And that's just because the numbers aren't in your favor. Lauren, is there anything that came up that you wanted me to specifically weigh in on?
I don't think we went over anything so far as questions. Olivia, correct me if I'm wrong. I know some came up earlier in the session. Are there any that you think Dean Suhu could speak to?
I am scrolling back through.
I think one question that maybe you could help with, Dean Suhu, is for a letter of recommendation, if you are getting it from a professor, maybe that you had a class with your sophomore year of college, so you won't be applying for like 2 or 3 or how many years from then, would you recommend having them write it right then and then update it later? Or how do you view those letters that might come from a little bit like earlier in your college career?
It depends a little bit on sort of what your experience with that person has been and the quality of the letter. But, and Lauren, I'm not sure if this came up because I wasn't on earlier, but I think what's more important ideally is people that have longitudinal experience with you. And so, you know, the fact that you took a class with someone sophomore year and did well is not super impressive from a letter of recommendation point of view, because I can look at your transcript and I can see that you took that class and did well. And so all that person is going to really say in most cases is, so-and-so was in my class and they were engaged and they did well. That's not particularly meaningful to me in the context of other letters that we get that show more depth in terms of their knowledge of you and what you bring to the table. So if it's someone that you took a class with sophomore year and then you TA'd for them or you did research with them and they can speak to more competencies than just you got an A in my class, then I think that would be meaningful. But if you just took their class and got an A, well, that's kind of a dime a dozen.
Yeah, thanks, Dean Suhu. I think that answers it well. We have been getting some in the chat. Say, how is a GPA calculated with graduate school degrees? Probably wondering if it's separate or lumped in, and then can a graduate school GPA help with a poor undergraduate GPA?
Yeah, so they're looked at separately, so they're not like averaged, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But the main reason is that, you know, for most graduate school degrees, the number of credit hours is going to actually be less than your undergraduate degree because it tends to be less than 4 years. And so even if you got a 4.0 in a graduate program, if you average it with if you didn't do great in undergrad, it wouldn't necessarily look good, even though from my point of view, it demonstrates your academic ability now versus how you might have done, you know, some years in the past. So I think it certainly can help a poor undergraduate degree. And in fact, if you have a poor undergraduate GPA, and poor is relative to the school you're applying to some degree, but if you don't have what you think is a competitive undergraduate GPA, then it doesn't have to be necessarily a degree program, but I do like to see that people have done some post-bac work that they've succeeded in. Because what it says to me is that I'm thoughtful about my application. I recognize that my GPA is a little bit lower, and there might be a number of reasons for that. But regardless, on paper, it looks like you either, you know, didn't try as hard or whatever it might be. And then when I see someone that does graduate work and does well, I say, okay, like this person has recognized a deficiency in their application. They've worked to address it. They've shown me their academic ability in these higher level graduate courses. So it doesn't have to be a degree, but I think graduate level work is important if you have a subpar undergraduate degree. My personal opinion.
Jitsuhu, one other question about letters of recommendation in general. How do you view getting letters of recommendation from different parts of your life? As in, like, one from an extracurricular activity and one from an academic setting and one from maybe something else totally unrelated, versus all coming from like a similar arena of your life?
Yeah, I think that depends what your experiences and opportunities have been. I do think we see, you know, people talk a lot about people being well-rounded, and I think that's a good thing. We also see people that are what I would say are well unbalanced, meaning they've done like a really lot of in-depth work in a particular area, whether that's leadership, volunteer work, clinical care, research, et cetera. And so maybe they have 3 really wonderful letters from research mentors. That's okay with me. What I would want to see is, who do you think you've interacted with that can speak to different competencies that we might value in our entering medical students? And so I don't want to see the same letter over and over again, but I don't mind if they're from a similar arena, if they speak positively to competencies that we care about, whether that's empathy, teamwork, written and verbal communication skills, work ethic, et cetera. And those skills and competencies can be demonstrated across a variety of domains. So there isn't a right answer to that one.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. Thank you. And one I just got in a direct message, which is always a difficult question to answer, is what are the most important parts that are looked at in an application?
There is, you know, unfortunately, there isn't a single thing. And if there was, it would be on Google or StudentDoctorNet or whatever, and we wouldn't need to have this conversation. It's fascinating, actually. If you look at the data, there's students with incredibly high GPAs and incredibly high MCATs every year in the top box of those metrics that don't get into medical school, about 8% of them or something like that. And there's people in sort of the very bottom corner on the opposite end that do get in. And so certainly it's not 100% metric driven. Metrics are important in some ways, because I know that this is not 100% true, but I think on average, someone with a 4.0 either worked harder or is smarter than someone with a 3.0 or both. That's not always true, because there's differences in opportunity, and there's differences in educational environments, and there's differences in educational resources. There's also a huge variability across institutions and how they grade, et cetera. So it's not that you're almost never comparing apples to apples when you're looking at these applications. And so we try to contextualize what we see in the setting of what we think people's background and educational opportunities have been. And so, you know, if you've not done a lot of volunteer work because you've worked 2 jobs to put yourself through college, I'm okay with that, because that demonstrates a different aspect of grit and resiliency that we value in our future physicians. It's not always easy to discern those things, though. So, you know, and also I think what's most important depends a little bit on the bias of who's ever reading it, if I'm being honest. And everybody brings their own biases to the table. And so, you know, if you have a physician reading your application who, you know, had a lower GPA but has succeeded, then they're gonna not care as much about your GPA or versus, you know, XYZ. So there's a little bit, and I hate that this is the reality of it, but there's some randomness to the whole process as well. So I know on the applicant side, it would be great if there was this formula and, you know, 1 + 1 = 2 all the time, but it just doesn't. So you'll get interviews that you think you shouldn't have gotten, and you won't get interviews that you think you should have gotten. And it's an imperfect process. The only thing I'll say about the fact that it's imperfect is it's a super sort of thoughtful human endeavor on our side, and we are doing the very, very best we can to try and sort out from pixels on paper who you are and what your goals are and what you might bring to our institution and what our value alignment is and what you might bring to the future profession of medicine. And we don't always get it right, but the intentions and the care that we bring to the process are really very genuine. But I know it's hard on the applicant side. It's very hard on our side as well. But I recognize that we're usually holding the cards.
And Ditsu, just to kind of follow up on that idea of how many variables go into the selection process, what advice would you give applicants on selecting whether to apply to a school or to not apply to a school? I know that's a pretty broad question.
No, I mean, I do think I would start, because it's easy and it's data driven and there's some validity to it, I'd start with metrics, right? So if you go to the MSAR and you're not even in range, and you can see, right, that the screen that was up when I joined, I think was from our MSAR, and you can see the range of people that we are average and the range of people that we accept. And so if you're not even within spitting distance of that, then okay, that might not make sense this time around. And you might get lucky, but that's sort of why they put that data out there, is to help people make those decisions. You know, and then I would just sort of think critically about, you know, percentage of in-state, out-of-state, if it's a state school, et cetera, and what your chances really might be. And then I think the other thing you need to do is sort of recognize how competitive the pool is overall. And many of us were, you know, towards our pools or got certain awards or honors or XYZ, but so did pretty much everybody else in the pool. And so I think that's what's hard to see on the applicant side, is just the scope of the pool overall and how talented they are. We do not have an initial screening to throw out apps. We do have some, I'd say what we have is the opposite. We do have some initial tools that will automatically bring an app into our secondary process. But then everything gets a manual review at some point.
Dean Suhu, one that came a little earlier that I don't think we got to is, as far as GPA, if you have a good cumulative GPA relative to the medical school you're looking at, but you have a lower science GPA, can your cumulative GPA help out the fact that you don't have as strong of a science GPA?
I'd say yes, within reason. If they're wildly disparate, then I'm a little bit concerned by the lack of consistency in your academic performance. If there's, you know, there's a difference, I don't lose sleep over that. And in fact, I mean, the other thing I'll say is we have people with sort of wildly different numbers of science, you know, and math credit hours. We don't have any specific prerequisites at this point. And so we don't require that you have a math or science, you know, major or minor. And so, you know, some people have limited hours in those subjects and some people have more depending on their interest in major. I think, again, we look at, you know, what are the skills that you've acquired and how have you demonstrated your academic ability? And I actually don't care personally like too much about what those courses are in, other than, you know, there's a decent amount of science in medical school. So if you can't perform well in science courses, then that is, I think, a cause for concern for you as well as for me. I don't want to bring you into a situation where it looks like you're going to not be successful. And so if I was in that situation where I had a really significantly lower science GPA compared to my total undergraduate GPA, I would take some post-bac science courses to demonstrate my current ability in science courses. Cassie, I don't know if it takes you 6 years to finish school. I don't really lose sleep over that if you've done well, and or if you have an explanation that sort of makes sense and is cohesive with the rest of your application. I think military experience can be certainly a positive because it often, although not always, is reflected in certain competencies that we value, such as commitment to something, resilience, grit, and understanding of teamwork, etc. I think if you've learned those things through military experience and can articulate them well and reflect the values of our institution that are in alignment with that, then I don't think that's a problem. That being said, the majority of our applicants do not have military experience, but that's just a reality of like who applies to medical school. Chelsea, does real life experience matter? Sure. I mean, yes and no. I mean, if you got to study abroad, I mean, that's great. Many people don't have access to that opportunity, so we recognize that. I think what's more important than any specific experience is how did you grow from it and what did you learn? And so if you studied abroad and you're reflecting back to me some cultural competency and an understanding of the world around us that's mature and varied, and into which you bring that lived experience and then reflect it back in terms of how it's going to inform your life and your career, then I think that's great. If you, partied in Spain for 6 months, like great for you, but that's a little bit of a different experience than someone that is able to reflect back a mature understanding of those kinds of experiences.
Dean Suhu, could I ask you kind of a CU specific question?
Sure.
Thank you. So I was reading that CU School of Medicine now has a Fort Collins branch, but on my MSAR or anything, it only shows up as just CU School of Medicine Anschutz. Do you elect to only apply to the Fort Collins branch or one or the other?
Great question. So the reason they're not separate on MSAR or AMCAS is it's not like a separate application process. So what happens is people get accepted to the CU School of Medicine. And then, yes, as you sort of intimated, they can elect a preference to be in one of our sort of different programs, for instance, the Fort Collins branch. And then you would apply to that branch and then potentially be accepted and then matriculate there. But your degree is still from the CU School of Medicine, regardless of what branch or program you complete. They're not separate schools and not separate degree programs. And those are post-admissions decisions. So if you're interested in one of our branches or programs, it doesn't affect whether or not you get an interview or whether or not you get in. It's only after you get in, you're then able to select a preference to be in one of our special branches or programs.
I see. So it's all under one application.
Correct.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
I would, Monet. I would. That makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. So Monet, again, I came from a state that didn't have its own med school, but I applied to most of the regional schools that I had that like connection to, unless I didn't have some of the coursework that they were going to want, or I wasn't going to be able to do it, again, pre-COVID, like I wasn't going to be able to do it not online. Or if there was something about like the school location or like their mission statement that didn't really like vibe with me, like that's where if you're going to trim any out, I would keep it pretty minimal and make sure that it's for really good reasons. Actually, on that note, since it's about 7:32, how to stand out at CU as an out-of-state applicant. I was like, Dean Suhu's making a face.
I don't have any specific advice. I mean, the reality is our class ends up usually being about 50-50. And only 7% of my applicants are from Colorado. So 93% are from out of state. So, the problem with standing out is you're trying to stand out among 10,000 people. So I don't have any specific advice. Once again, there's not a formula, but ideally you've demonstrated excellence in some aspects of the things that we value, and have, are mature and communicate well, and sort of communicate your story and journey well in your application.
And that's all stuff that would be true for in-state people as well, Olivia. So yeah, like, and it's tough for us. It's tough for us because like Lauren and I are both out of state, and like, I mean, I can't tell you why I got into CU. Like I have guesses about the things that like made me connect better with people at this school than some of the other places I interviewed. But like, again, it's a guess. Like Dean Suhu said, a lot of this is so random. So, I mean, the biggest thing, honestly, like just be yourself. Is corny as that sounds, because like you don't want to stand out as something that you're not and then end up at a school that you actually don't fit in well at. So like choose your schools carefully, and then just be you. I had a really laid back interview day at CU, and I think that was when I was like, this is it. I know, I can tell, because like I'm just cool as a cucumber. Elena's question about how many medical schools would be ideal to apply to, that really comes down to you, and for a lot of people it is like no small portion of that is kind of decided by your budget, because the whole application process is generally not cheap. It also depends on like, if I grew up in Texas, and like if I still lived in Texas, I honestly might have just applied to those in-state schools and called it, and that would have defined my number. I cast a wider net because I was non-traditional, and because I knew that there were certain schools that were going to look at me and go like, she's coming from several seasons of like dirt bagging and teaching snowboarding, and we don't like that. Or there were going to be schools that looked at it and go, wow, that's really cool. Like, I bet, she writes about it really well. We really like that. And I didn't know which way it was going to go. And so I cast a broad net, but I had the resources to do that. And for that, I am very fortunate. But it really just kind of depends on you and how you build your list. You'll see all kinds of different information all over the internet. There are some people that apply to one school because that is the only place they want to go, and they will wait and wait and wait through different cycles. And then there are people that will apply to every school that they can get their hands on an application for, or I guess submit an application for. So there's not a hard and fast answer to that one either. Yeah, no problem. On that, do we have any, I'm going to go ahead and do like a last call for questions, since we're running a little bit over time, which like I could chat about this all night, but I probably shouldn't. So last call for questions.
Yeah, I just have a logistics thing. I found out about this through one of my club sponsors forwarded me the email for the seminar. I was wondering if I could get added to your guys' email list for future stuff. Or do you just check the website, or I don't know how it works.
I saw Lauren unmute and I thought she was going to take that. Yeah, I think we should be able to get you on our listserv. You can send one of us your email, or, we'll get it to the right person. You can DM any one of us.
Awesome. Thank you very much.